I had 2 unopened parachutes, and I was hurtling towards the earth at 100 miles an hour. I realized that impact with the earth at that speed means the end of the human body. I then experienced what I would describe as terrifying fear. And terrifying fear is appalling loneliness, the feeling of being utterly abandoned, where one's knowledge is no further use. There is nobody that can help.
Why do large groups of people hurl themselves out of aeroplanes and into the sky? Simply for fun. Or, in a more refined sense, for adventure. Thousands of jumps are made each year according to plan. But on rare occasions, the unexpected happens, and suddenly the time between life and death can be measured in seconds. In Dead Men's Tales, with some of the world's most experienced skydivers, we've reconstructed 6 of the sky's great escape stories. Danger always attracts spectators. Fascination with something going wrong is a guaranteed crowd puller. It was ever thus. 85 years ago, Edwardian Fairgrounds played host to a fascinating and dangerous novelty act. Ladies parachuting to the ground from a balloon 3,000 feet in the air.
I am the daughter of Dolly Shepherd, who was an Edwardian parachutist. Now, the incident which I am about to tell you happened in Longton in June 1908, when she was going to make a simple jump from the side of a basket with a novice parachutist, Louis May. It was supposed to be a perfectly normal double descent from the side of a balloon, but this time using the largest balloon in the country, called the Mammoth. But unfortunately, a sudden sharp shower of rain damaged the balloon, and so as not to disappoint the public, the captain decided to use Dolly's small solo balloon and make an improvised attachment for Louis. Well, they started off at about 8 o'clock, a little later than usual, and of course they rose into the air, and Louis was fascinated by this new sensation and this wonderful toy town view beneath.
Look at those little houses.
Well, at about 3,000 feet, Dolly prepared to let go of the cord which linked the 2 girls, because at that time there was, of course, no harness. They merely had a sling which went between the legs just to help support the body, and they just held on to the trapeze bar with their hands. Louis pulled her release cord, but nothing happened. She pulled several times, but still remained attached, and they rose up toward the gathering clouds. Now, by 8,000 feet, Dolly was really worried. However, at that point, they went through the clouds, And as they came out of the clouds, Louis looked down and realized that the Earth had disappeared.
We're going awfully high.
Well, by this time, they were over 11,000 feet, and Dolly knew that she would have to do something, and at once. There was only one thing she could do, take Louis down on her parachute. So she pulled Louis to her, crooked her arms round Louis's cords, holding the two parachute strings together, and told Louis of the plan. As this was Louis's first ascent, she was wearing the belt. This was only used, really, to placate a particularly nervous public, and that had to be undone. So both of them, using one hand and holding tightly to their respective bars with the other, they pulled and tugged and twisted until at last the belt was released. And then Dolly asked Louis to perform an incredible feat. With a drop of 2 miles beneath, to transfer from one parachute to the other. As calmly as she could, she said, "Now, take your legs from the sling, one by one, and put them round my waist. Now, your arms, one by one, put them round my neck." Now, that meant, of course, that the two girls were entrusted to the one chute and to Dolly's arms.
Hold on tight.
Then she said, "If you've never said a prayer before, say one now." And holding them both with one hand, she pulled the ripping cord. Well, of course, they fell like a stone, and the parachute just shook and shivered, and it didn't open until they were actually through the cloud.
Very fast.
Then, of course, they fell from the skies, fortunately landing in a field, but just missing an upturned side.
Look out, hold tight. We're landing.
So Dolly threw herself back, but with Louis entwined round her body, she bounced heavily on her.
Dolly.
Louis wasn't hurt,
Dolly, are you
but
all right?
Dolly couldn't move.
Dolly. Dolly.
Within seconds, two farmers and their families appeared, and Farmer Hollins sent someone on a bicycle to fetch a doctor who arrived half an hour later in a pony and trap. So using a door, she was taken into the farmhouse, and by the time they had prepared an improvised fracture bed, she was paralyzed, her body was twisted, and she couldn't speak. And it was only thanks to a local doctor who used a very primitive form of electrical treatment, no electricity, of course, but using a battery and the old farmer to form the circuit with steel plates on her hips and on her back. He got her walking, so that within 2 months she was back in the air, and this accident has now become known as the first mid-air rescue. But of course she did continue parachuting after that until the spring of 1912, when she heard an ethereal voice when she was up in the air telling her not to jump again or she'd been killed. So very calmly she said, "All right," and she made that her last jump.
"70 years later in Florida, sky jumping became skydiving. The idea being to get a large group of people into the same piece of sky. It all begins with 5 floaters hanging onto the fuselage of a Dakota. When they let go, the divers follow. It can take as long as 12 seconds for everyone to clear the aeroplane. As the last of the divers leaves, the floaters are already hundreds of feet below. At least, that's where they should be.
Okay, for those people manifested on 40 Tango, Staggerlow's load, Golfand and Withers with 9, Falsgraf and Track. That's 17 people if you want to go.
My name's Jim Hooper, and I was owner-operator of the world's largest sport parachute center in Florida, Zephyr Hills, from 1972 until 1984.
What is new load?
I remember one midday, we had put a load of skydivers into our Dakota.
Check without your manifest so we can locate it, please. Thank you.
The DC-3 we were using had actually been built in 1942. And even going on 50 years old, the old girl was still a favorite amongst skydivers. And probably more jumps have been made out of Dakotas than any other single airplane in the world. We would put 40 jumpers on board and typically send them up to 12,500 feet, which would take about 25 minutes. Michelle Reed, captain in the Canadian Paris, had come down to Zephyr Hills for the first time, and I'm sure not expecting anything out of the ordinary to happen. The aircraft would line up on jump run, flying into the wind at 12,500 feet. As they approached the exit point, the pilot would throttle back, and the jumpers would exit in groups to perform a series of free-fall maneuvers that would last about 1 minute for separating at approximately 3,500 feet to track away from each other to gain adequate separation so they could safely open their parachutes. I was on the ground watching the free fall. As soon as I saw their parachutes open and that everyone was open safely, I went back into the office. And some 10 minutes later, when the airplane had descended to perhaps 2,000 feet, one of my staff came in and said, "Hoop, there's something hanging under the airplane." Well, we had a cinematographer who had attached 2 cameras on the outside of the Dakota, and I was quite sure that this was what they were seeing. Told them not to worry about it. A few minutes later, another of my staff came in and repeated the same thing. There was something hanging underneath the airplane. So, convinced that there wasn't, I nonetheless got up, walked outside, and saw a lump, a figure, hanging underneath the door of this Dakota. And looked through a powerful set of binoculars that we had mounted on a tripod. Sure enough, there was a body suspended underneath the airplane, underneath the door of the airplane. What had happened was that Michel's group was the last one to exit the airplane, and his position was a rear floater's position. He swung himself out of the door of the airplane, aft of the door, with his left leg still inside. Go! As he left the airplane, his jumpsuit had slipped over a pin at the bottom of the door, and the pin punched a hole just above the cuff of his jumpsuit. And being an acrylic jumpsuit, it was not going to tear, even with the weight of him hanging outside the airplane. And there was no way for him to cut himself loose. The airplane was descending at 180 miles an hour. And he simply did not have the physical strength to pull himself back up into the door. The jumper was completely hidden from the pilot's viewpoint. And in fact, had the pilot even turned around and looked, he would have only seen an empty cabin. As soon as the last jumper exited the airplane, the pilot would have put it into a hard spiraling bank, descending at about 2,000 feet a minute, and would have been on the ground in about 10 minutes. The pilot had no way of knowing that there was a jumper trailing outside the airplane. Had no way of knowing he was about to spread somebody all over the runway. Well, I yelled at one of my staff to call the rescue squad, the ambulance, jumped in a pickup truck. And because that day we did not have radio communication, my ground radio had broken, I thought the only solution was to prevent the pilot from landing. So I drove out onto the runway, down the middle of the runway, and by this time he was on short final, a few hundred yards off the end of the runway. The pilot obviously saw me, but ignored me, apparently thinking I was going to pick up an injured jumper. When I saw that he was committed to landing, I swerved off the side of the runway, at which point the Dakota passed me, going in the opposite direction, just off the ground. And I still have this vivid picture in my mind of this chap hanging by one leg from the door with his hands behind his head, pulling himself as far forward as he possibly could. Well, I turned the wheel of the truck, looked over my shoulder, watched the tail come down very slowly, and saw him hit the runway. At which point there was a puff of blue smoke, and I thought, he's dead. He has to be dead. By this time, some of our parachutist jumpers had run out onto the runway to stop the airplane. We had the rescue squad there, the ambulance, police, blue lights, red lights flashing. A pilot, who was completely mystified, stopped the airplane, shut down both engines, unstrapped himself from the seat, and began walking back down the aisle. He saw a foot jammed in the doorway. Looked out, and here was Michel Reed with his shoulders flat on the runway, arms outstretched, grin from ear to ear, and saying over and over, "I'm alive. I'm alive."
Use this reserve again, mate.
What in fact saved him was his parachute, because as his back came down and touched the runway, of course it was the parachute that touched first, the cushioning effects of the parachute nylon on the runway saved his life. By the time the airplane had stopped, only about 2 inches of that nylon had been worn and melted away. We cut him loose from the airplane, cut his jumpsuit loose, put a backboard under him, because we were sure that he had to have sustained serious internal injuries. Moved him back up to the Parachute Center building. And we had paramedics and one of our jumpers, who was a medical doctor, check him over from top to bottom, side to side. And he did not have one scratch on him. And they put a blood pressure cuff on him, and it registered absolutely normal. And I said, guys, do me a favor, check me out. And my blood pressure was just about off the scale. They said, Mr. Hooper, we think you're about ready to have a stroke. Afterwards, he went straight off down to the off-license and bought about 3 cases of beer. And the last I saw of him that night, he was well into his cups, and the story was getting better and better.
Most stories improve in the telling. The narrator always enjoys the danger more in retrospect, from the safety of the pub or the dinner table. And there is some irony in Michel Reed's story. His life was saved by a parachute that never opened.
That was close, Jacko. Stay there! Come up on break. I've lost you. Whoa, Jacko. More brakes! Just see you.
Stacking parachutes in the sky is an altogether different aerial skill, and it demands a peculiar kind of precision. It involves the controlled docking of one parachute onto another. The world record is 24 and just waiting to be broken.
Nice one.
15 years ago, stacking was an experiment, something to be tried out.
All right, this particular incident took place over the Hull show, which was a demonstration jump that we were doing, we being the Royal Marine team. I had about 300 jumps, so I was fairly inexperienced at the time. And the guy that I was doing this particular exercise with was a fellow by the name of Pete Guest. And he also had about 300 jumps at that time. We had left the aircraft, and I was actually jumping a still camera on the jump to take some photographs of the guys in freefall. We'd finished the freefall, we'd tracked away, deployed our parachutes, and I looked for Pete so that we could go ahead and do our hookup. We got together reasonably quickly, and before I continued with getting myself sorted out on his parachute, I turned us onto the heading that we wanted to be on and started moving towards the drop zone. I've taken hold of Pete's canopy and I'm working my way down his rigging lines. I've shouted down to him to put on a little bit of brake to make it easier for me to go down his lines. And as I start to do this, my canopy develops an inbuilt left turn. I don't want to go left because the drop zone's over here to my right. And I found something happened which was unusual, which I hadn't experienced before, in as much as the canopy didn't really want to go where I was steering it. Now, what I didn't realize is that as I'm going down his rigging lines, my steering toggle has hooked around one of Pete's rigging lines on his canopy. And I just called down to Pete. I said, I don't know what's happening. I don't like this. I'm letting you go, and we'll scrub around it. So I kicked myself out of his rigging lines, went to take hold of my steering toggles, and as I brought my hands up, my canopy developed a vicious left spiral. And it happened so fast that I just didn't know what was happening. I hadn't got a clue. But all I remember seeing was one length of rigging line going from me to Pete's canopy, who was now down below me and about, I don't know, 15, 20 feet away. And I looked up to see what was happening to my parachute, and there is the tail of my parachute has been dragged right the way down, and it's through my connector links about 3 feet away from me. You can imagine I'm absolutely horrified. And at this stage, I was well clear of Pete. Pete's here, and my canopy's out here, and I'm here, and we're going around each other. And this is getting worse and worse as the seconds go by. And I can remember very clearly shouting to Pete, "I'm cutting away." I suddenly realized with the centrifugal force of us going round each other, my hands are about 3 times heavier than they usually are. And now I'm really starting to worry, because I remember that last time I looked at my altimeter, I'm about 1,200 feet, and I don't like to be cutting away anything less than about 1,000 feet to be happy about it. I can see Pete flashing backwards and forwards between me, and I'm having to try and time it so that I don't release myself and drop straight down through his canopy. So I'm using all my strength now to try and get to my R3s, and when I do get hold of them, bang, they're gone, and I'm away in freefall. And as I release and I go back into freefall, I suddenly think Pete's going to be cutting away as well. And the helicopter that I'd jumped from is now sort of making efforts to come down. The pilot has been watching this all the way through, apparently. I have disappeared down behind these trees in freefall from their viewpoint. And they think that's it. It's been nice knowing Gary. So I'm thinking, how long do I dare leave it before I pull my reserve, so that I don't have Pete hustling down and colliding with my reserve canopy? And I just closed my eyes and picked a figure of 3 seconds, held my reserve handle, counted 3 and pulled. When I opened my eyes and looked at the ground, all I can see is house rooftops. My canopy's not open yet. I can feel that I'm about to the stage where I've got full line stretch. And I've got this camera switch in my hand. And I'm not consciously thinking I'm going to be dead in 3 seconds, but it was a foregone conclusion. But all I can remember thinking is, I wonder what that photograph's going to come out like. So I just put my finger on the button and thought, I'll use up the film. At least I'll get rid of the whole film before I hit the ground. And then, much to my relief, the canopy deployed, my feet hit the ground. And I looked up, and there's my canopy is draped over a telephone line. And I've landed in about a 15-foot long stretch of very nicely mown lawn and rose beds, beautiful rose bushes bordering all the way down the side of this garden. And I look up, and there's this little old lady standing in the doorway of a kitchen saying, "Would you like a cup of tea?" I said, "Yes, please, that'd be very nice." And she said, "You're ever so good. You didn't even hit my rose bushes."
A parachute works only if you pull the ripcord and open it up. It takes a conscious effort. But if you're not conscious, can someone else do it for you?
49 degrees right now here at the Desert Wind, 105.
In 1986 in Coolidge, Arizona, at the annual skydiving boogie, Greg Robertson found all his skydiving skills put to the test. The headline writers had a field day. Newspapers and TV stations jammed his office switchboard. Editors, short of hard news, ran out of superlatives. Comparisons with Superman became inevitable as the media created its own brand new all-American hero.
I was the safety and training advisor here, and my job was to keep an eye on the other jumpers, make sure operations went smoothly and safely. And I was working as the load master for the DC-3 also. I would load the people and tell them when to get out of the aircraft, make sure they got out at the right spot. We were in the hangar packing after one jump, and I noticed this girl having trouble packing her parachute. So I went over and talked to her, helped her untangle it, made sure she was able to pack it, found out she was relatively inexperienced. So I said, well, I'll just keep my eye on her a little bit. We went out to the airplane for the next load. She was on it with a 6-way group. And I decided to put them out last, seeing as they were all relatively inexperienced, and decided to follow them out. So while we're going to altitude, I was keeping an eye on them, and we started putting people out. And when they lined up as the last group, I noticed she was the last person exiting the aircraft, which didn't really make sense to me, seeing as she had the lowest number of jumps. I would expect her to be in the forward part. So I follow them out, and I watch her body position, and she's got a real good track position, position we use in skydiving to move from one point to another. That's where the body is real straight, the arms are back at their sides, their toes are pointed away from them. They try to streamline themselves as much as possible. Got down to where the other people were, and there was 3 of them together, already holding hands. Another one was slightly low on the formation, and he's trying to come back up in what we refer to as the dead spider position, where he's trying to gather as much air as possible and put his arms slightly downward and cup his body, figures such as this. Another one was coming in to join hands, and this girl, Debbie, was down there, but she's doing what's called orbiting, where she's just sort of sliding around and not getting into the formation. And all of a sudden, this 4th person who was approaching the formation just lands right on top of another jumper and grabs a hold, and this 3-way plus this other jumper just falls out of the sky in what's called a funnel. quite dramatic, actually. I said, well, I best go on over and hook up with this girl since she's inexperienced, and motion to her to pull a little higher since we've got these people now about 500 or 600 feet below us. So I start moving towards her, and at the same time, she starts diving towards this group of people that's now 500 feet below us. She isn't really watching where she's going, and she whacks right onto that other jumper that had been low on the formation to begin with. Hits him real hard. They collided what I guessed was around 50 miles an hour and just threw them both for a loop. And they're both tumbling. And now I've got a dilemma. They both look like they're in trouble. Well, luckily the guy that Debbie had hit righted himself right away. And I figured, okay, he's okay. I can see his arms moving. But she's still on her back spinning. She passes below me about 25 feet down, accelerating away. And I'm looking right at her face, and I notice it looks like a clown face, red all around, big red mouth. And I realize all of a sudden it's blood, and she's definitely injured. I had to get down there and help her. And I knew we only had probably around 30 seconds left before we would hit the ground. So I go into a headlong dive trying to build my speed up to around 180. And I notice now that I'm catching up to her. She's no longer accelerating away from me. So I tuck my head back down and go back into the dive. As I got down to her, I saw her arm move. Maybe she's trying to pull her ripcord. It didn't seem to have that definite pull of a conscious skydiver, but I thought maybe she was not totally knocked unconscious, but still semi-conscious, and her mind was reminding her she needed to pull, and that's what she was trying to do, but there just wasn't enough movement there. And I finally decided she wasn't going to pull it, and I was going to have to. And then the realization comes to me that I have absolutely no idea how far above the ground we are. And a moment of uncertainty comes over me, and I finally just say, well, I've come this far, I'm not stopping now. I let the legs swing around and grab her down by her lower leg straps, turn her over, and deploy her parachute. And as I see her pilot chute and bag lifting off her back, I said, well, there's your chance, girl. Turn around and deploy myself. So I look back up and I find a square reserve, and I go, okay, lay she open. And I start following underneath her, and she's slumped in her harness such that she's in a slow right turn, and it's bringing us back around towards the drop zone. So I land, probably about 30 seconds before her, and I gather up my parachute, and I keep running towards where she's landing. She lands. And people all of a sudden realize she's not getting up.
Call for a doctor!
Before I went up on the next load, I went out and talked to the paramedics. They told me she had broken ribs, which I found out later to be 9, and she had massive internal injuries. She had bruised her heart, and the ribs had punctured her lungs, and her spleen was skewered. And there's 3 places, I reckon, that the injuries could have occurred. The first was the collision itself in free fall. I'm fairly certain that's where she broke the 9 ribs and the heart got bruised. The second was the opening of the parachute. And the third was the landing. Since it was uncontrolled, I'm fairly sure that that's where those ribs just bit in and skewered and punctured everything. But today she's alive and well, and she's actually skydiving in Hawaii.
Jumping out of aeroplanes may be the ultimate form of free expression. Experienced skydivers go through a series of free-fall maneuvers before opening their parachutes. But traditionally, most people begin their parachuting days clipped to the inside of the aeroplane fuselage. A static line stays attached until the jumper begins to fall. Then the parachute opens and gravity takes care of what's left of the process. It always does so. That is, unless something interferes with the laws of nature.
All right, guys, keep it closed out the back. I'm going to put you next to the pilot behind his seat.
Halfpenny Green was a very active parachute centre in those days, and I, being the duty pilot, would be possibly flying anything up to 15 trips per day. And these would vary students exiting at about 2,500 feet. Various stages of free-fallers going up from 3,000 feet to about 10,000 feet. Obviously, I got to know quite a lot of the instructors, and a chap that comes to mind was a jolly fellow called Mick Reeves. Quite a flamboyant character. We flew together on many occasions, and Mick Reeves dispatched the first student without a problem, and then prepared the second one for his exit.
Put it in. Stand by. Cut! In the door! Head up! Go!
When he left the aeroplane, the static line somehow wrapped around his pack, with the net result that he was left dangling about 12 feet below the aeroplane.
What's happened? He's hung up!
Left poor old Mick with quite a problem. What do we do now?
You have to gain some height. Get height. Get it up.
I was at the front with engines pulled back, airspeed decaying, and an aeroplane that was trying to stand on its tail. It certainly crossed my mind that I may well have to get rid of the parachutist on the aircraft and land back with this chap hanging. It would have meant landing on the grass beside the runways, and I'm pretty sure that the chap wouldn't have fared too well.
I'm going to give you my knife. Yeah. When I climb down there, I'll give you a signal. Cart's free. Right.
We struggled around to about 2,300 or 400 feet, crossing the DZ, and he told me he was going to shim down the line, cut the sky free, and then pull his ripcord. I'm quite surprised that the poor fellow didn't have a heart attack, especially when his training had been to expect an automatic opening of a chute on exit. The run-in started about 2,000 feet, so by the time Mick had shinned down the line and they'd cut Mike Davis free, both got their chutes open, it does make me wonder whether Mike was much above 1,000 feet when his chute was fully deployed. Well, Mick and his student landed. I brought the aeroplane back, and of course we all had a little chat about it. And then in due course, the George Medal was awarded to Mick, and the watch to me.
Skydivers wear two parachutes. If the main one doesn't open properly, the reserve will surely do so. It's inconceivable that both parachutes will fail to work. But if such a thing does happen, what are the odds on survival? Noel Farrelly is the man who truly fell to earth.
People have asked me, has the accident changed my life in any way? And the answer must be no. But what it has done is given me a greater understanding of myself and other human beings, and a greater sympathy with those in pain or discomfort. I now know that most people can achieve an awful lot more than they realize. It just takes a crisis to bring this fact out. If somebody had told me a week before that this would happen to me, I think I would have died of shock. Parachuting, for me, was the greatest discovery of my life. Like most people who do their one parachute jump, curiosity led me to that stage. But after that, it was the whole adventure that started to appeal to me. I felt that this was something really exciting, a little bit unusual. I've never been a great skydiver, and I suppose I never will be, but I really enjoy it. And I think it satisfies a sense of adventure that's in all human beings. In the spring of 1977, I was a member of a four-man team that came across to the Hereford Parachute Club at Shobden to do some practice jumps in preparation for a competition in Ireland. On this particular jump, my three colleagues had formed a star formation, and I was quite close, but I didn't actually close with them. However, I was a lot closer than on the previous practice jumps, and I was confident that the jumpsuit that I was using was really working very well. At 3,500 feet on this jump, I waved to my friends, did a 180-degree turn, and tracked away. At about 2,500 feet, I brought my hand in and pulled my ripcord. There was an interval, and then I was conscious of a flapping sound at my back. I didn't quite know what had happened because it wasn't the normal type of sounds that I had been used to. And I remember turning my head back and catching sight of one of the small spring-loaded pilot chutes that normally catch air and launch the main parachute. What I didn't know was that that pilot chute had come over my shoulders and crossed around my neck, creating a very, very tight knot and trapping the parachute, in fact, in its deployment sleeve, which is like a sock that keeps it packed neatly. The flapping sound continued, as did my free fall, and I knew for certain then that the canopy hadn't lifted itself off my back and deployed properly. And I knew that I was going to have to get my reserve parachute out at this point. The reserve parachute did what it was supposed to do. It shot out fast, past my face, but the last portion of the canopy just started flapping in my face. And I knew instinctively that something had gone dreadfully wrong. I glanced at my altimeter and I saw that we were running under 1,000 feet. I had two unopened parachutes and I was hurtling towards the earth at 100 miles an hour. Impact with the earth at that speed means the end of the human body. I then experienced terrifying fear. And terrifying fear is appalling loneliness, the feeling of being utterly abandoned, where one's knowledge is no further use. There is nobody that can help. I was at the point where I had a choice of despair or something else. And the something else was a very simple thing. I started to pray. I realized that I was going to be meeting my maker in a very short period of time, and I thought it might be a good idea to make a few introductions. I was now quite relaxed but it was a different kind of relaxation to what most people would experience. I didn't have any worry because I had offloaded my worry in effect. And my mind was working very, very fast. Time just seemed to expand. As many thoughts and memories raced through my mind, I found myself haunted by the words of a song. And it was called "The Carnival is Over." It was because I had always looked upon skydiving, the great carnival in the sky. I've had a good life. I've never had any serious unhappiness. I feel that being involved in skydiving was a great adventure. And if this is the way it was going to end, it was as good a note as any to go out on. I then recall glancing at my altimeter, and I was somewhere around 300 feet or so. And I can remember the ground spreading out in front and to the sides, rather like a huge green carpet full of patches being pulled from underneath me. I can also recall the horizon being slightly above my line of vision. A most unusual situation that no skydiver ever experiences in free fall. I can remember at this point too having my last conscious thought. This is going to be a very, very hard landing, but I know I'm going to survive. And then it was as if a black blanket or screen came down in front of me. And I remember nothing more. It was some time before the extent of my injuries were made known to me, but I did notice a trolley load of x-rays being pushed around. The major injuries started with the lung, my left lung collapsed, my left hip was broken, my left femur was fractured, my right tibia and fibia were totally smashed. It was a mother and father of a mess down there, and I'm very lucky that I didn't lose the leg.
Bingo. There you go.
That looks very like it. Yes.
There's the bow.
Yeah,
There's
that's
the hangar. Well, that's it. I'll tell you what's amazing, Noel, is that April 1977, when it happened, it hasn't really grown over a great deal, has it?
No, it hasn't. No. It's all very recognizable.
That's definitely the bow. As I remember it, you must have free fallen through the branches there and hit the bow.
Right.
It obviously decelerated you, and I found the indentation on the bank of the bow where you'd landed on it. So you then must have rolled down into here, and this is where I found you.
Even at a very early stage, I was thinking, how am I going to get back up in the air again and start jumping? I can recall talking to a physiotherapist and asking him, did he think I would ever be able to parachute again? And he smiled at me and he said, do you want to parachute again? I said, yes, I do. I really want to go back. And he said, well, you've answered your own question. If you want to, you will. Perhaps it was to boost my morale so that I would be able at least to walk again. Walking properly again would be the consolation prize, but jumping would be the ultimate goal. And 2 years, 10 months from the date of the accident, I repeated the jump with my same 3 friends. This time everything went fine.
People who manage to cheat death are certainly changed in the process, but never, it seems, frightened off by the experience. In most cases, survival reaffirms their commitment to the adventure. They simply go back and do it again.
My problem at the moment is I don't do enough of skydiving. But in about 12 years' time, I'll be retiring, and I hope to spend a lot more time in the air.